Normally when we hear about climate change, we hear about it in a negative way. Places are drying up, places are getting warmer, sea levels are rising. But actually, is it possible that climate change might be helping us to understand the Viking Age by providing new insights? Well, recently you might have seen this headline appearing if you're in the same circles that I am and do follow historical journals like this. And the headline reads, "Melting ice has uncovered hundreds of ancient Viking artifacts and a previously unknown trade route in Norway." And this is because actually thanks to the heating up of the climate, which, isn't a good thing, but I guess this is a silver lining. Lots of the ice has melted up in the high mountains of Norway, and so they've been able to find new Viking Age artifacts that give us more of an insight into what was happening in these places that had before been covered by ice and by snow, so we wouldn't have been able to find them. Now, I want to talk about the mountain trade routes in this video and a little bit about how these really high places, of course Norway has very high mountains, and often we tend to think that this would have made it very hard for people to communicate and that these were barriers. How actually during the Viking Age these might have connected people in a different way and been very important for trading at the time. But it's essential to remember that essentially today we live in the West, at least most of us, much more removed from nature than people back then. However, this wasn't the case back in the Viking Age, and to understand trade routes and what people were doing in the mountains, we need to understand a little bit about the nature of the time as well. Which is why I want to tell you a little bit about Magellan TV, because they actually have a documentary series called Wildest Arctic, where they look at some of these creatures. And this is important because you need to understand the animals before you can understand the trade routes that involve the animals. Magellan TV is an online paid-for streaming service. It's got hundreds of videos on lots of different topics by famous filmmakers, and I've covered them in a few. They've got videos on the Normans, there's one on the American buffalo and the nature in Greenland as well, and this time I would recommend having a look at the Wildest Arctic series, because that's really going to help get an understanding of the kinds of animals that people were hunting in the far north of Norway, and that then they were transporting over these mountain passes, which is what we're finding the archaeological evidence for now. So I would really highly recommend giving this a go, and actually there is an exclusive offer as well for viewers of my channel. If you follow the link, which is in the description below, try.magellantv.com/historywithhilbert, then you can actually get a free month on the trial period for the membership of Magellan TV just by following that link. And then if you don't fancy it, you can unsubscribe, or if you do, you can continue watching their documentaries on loads of different topics, as I said before. So thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. But to get back to what I was talking about with the Norwegian trade lanes, it's incredibly interesting that now we're starting to uncover these artifacts under the ice because things are warming up. And actually one study that has really prompted this, and actually that my supervisor in archaeology has been working on, is an excavation in a place called Lendbreen, and I think this is how it's meant to be pronounced in Norwegian, but don't roast me if you do speak Norwegian properly. And they found a lot of really interesting things at this place, and this is just to quote the study that was published very recently, just in April, on what they found. And basically it's looking at the methodology that they used, and they write, "The pass directly above the ice patch reaches 1,973 meters. In a pattern typical of the periodic expansion and contraction of ice patches in response to climatic change, melting ice has revealed lichen-free areas of scree and bedrock. It is here that most of the artifacts have been found, lying on bare ground. The finds have thus undergone vertical displacement and have sometimes also been moved laterally by meltwater and strong winds. Although ice patches are predominantly stationary, unlike glaciers, some ice deformation, displacement from the place of accumulation, also occurs. The positions of objects, especially those of light organic materials, as found during systematic survey and recorded by GPS, therefore do not reflect the precise location of their original deposition." So what Pillø, Finstad and Barrett are saying here essentially is that lots of these objects that have been discovered might have been found actually really close to where they were dropped, either accidentally or in some cases maybe actually dropped on purpose, that they were discarded for a reason, while some might have moved a little bit as well because of things that have gone on in the ages. But essentially, if you've seen some of the photos, and I'm not sure I can share them because I think they're copyrighted to the authors, but some of the conditions that things are in, they found a tunic, for example, is an amazing condition, and this is an Iron Age tunic, and you can still clearly see the fabric because it's been under that cold temperature under the ice. Even things like horse dung has been preserved. And it's just incredibly interesting and a really new way of looking at things. We had this in the Alps, for example, with Ötzi, who was this man from thousands of years ago who was very well preserved to the point where they could look at the gut bacteria that he had inside him. And this is something similar. Of course, we don't have a body, but we have lots of other artifacts. Another very interesting thing that we find along a lot of these routes are these cairns, which are essentially piles of rocks that are man-made, and this was to find their way up. And I'll get onto this a bit later as well. What's interesting is that they seem to have travelled these paths in the high mountains when there was snow. Now this seems a bit counterintuitive, because you might think when there's snow it's the winter, it's going to be much harder to get through, you have to plough through. But actually this might have made it easier, and these cairns would be so that people could follow these paths, these well-travelled paths. And that, it takes time to build up a cairn of rocks. So it suggests that there was time put into this by, not sure if we can call it a local community, but the community of traders that was moving and hunters that was moving along this path. So we find lots of different objects and artifacts that have been found here at Lendbreen. And this, for example, that we found part of, I say we, I wasn't there, they found part of a sled that was being used, so again suggesting snow travel, as well as a walking stick with runes inscribed on them, and lots of objects to do with horses. So it does seem that they were using horses to travel up there, which is very interesting, like horseshoes that I already mentioned, as well as the horse dung, which is incredibly interesting when you think that this has been preserved under the ice, and this was a route that was being used for in the Viking Age and before. Now the chronology is very interesting, because in Scandinavia we have the Nordic Bronze Age from about 1700 BC right through to around I think it's around 500 BC, and then into the Nordic Iron Age. And more specifically, you can then, break that down into the pre-Roman Iron Age and the Roman Iron Age. Remember, of course, that the Romans never invaded Norway, but this is when they had significant contact with the Danish chieftains, who did have more contact with the Romans. And then afterwards, you get the Vendel era moving into the Migration Age, and then the Viking Age from sort of the very late 8th century, early 9th century. And we can see various chronologies of the Lendbreen Pass if we put that on top of this chronology. Now, we find the first evidence of use around 1500 BC, so this is the Bronze Age, and what we see is mostly to do with hunting and then reindeer hunting. Often they would hunt reindeer on the ice patches, because in the summer lots of flies and parasites, they target the reindeer, so the reindeer would move onto patches of ice which are colder. Of course, for them it's not much of a big deal, but insects don't like the cold, so it would give them some respite from these parasites that are plaguing them. So what hunters would do is they would know they'd come to these ice patches, they would wait by these ice patches for the reindeer to move onto there in the summer, and then they'd hunt them, because they'd be in a smaller space together, so it'd be easier. So we find this for the Bronze Age up until around 500 BC, and then we have a lack of evidence of the hunting continuing, or of transport or people there. It's potentially possible that this is because of fine distribution, not because they actually stopped hunting. This is something with archaeology. We don't know if we stop seeing evidence, that we just haven't found the evidence yet, or there's another reason why we don't see the evidence, or whether it does indeed indicate that there was a cessation in the actual hunting practice that went on. Nevertheless, from about 300 AD, we find that hunting continues, but also around that time that there's evidence for transport, so it's being used for transport as well, not just for hunting purposes, which is when we start to find the evidence of horse-drawn transport, the horseshoes, the horse dung, etc. And at that, about around the year 1000, this was the most intense period of transport and hunting, which is slap bang in the middle of the Viking Age. So why were people up here so high up in the mountains and travelling when there was snow on the ground? Well, one of the big reasons, and one we have lots of evidence for as well, is that it was due to cattle. Now, lots of people held cattle during this period. And actually in the summer, of course, it's a bit warmer, there's less snow around, and so you can take cattle up higher onto higher ground that's normally covered in snow in the winter and graze them there. And this is essential because if you keep grazing cattle on the same ground, the ground's not going to be particularly good for long. They're going to run out, it's not a good model. So what this is transhumance. It's essentially moving the cattle around to new pastures, which you can do. You can move them higher up in the summer, and that's what we see a lot of the evidence for. These mountain paths would be used to go to summer farms. Now, a lot of the time, these summer farms as well, they would actually produce goods. We tend to think in the middle of the mountains of Norway, you'd be completely cut off from the world. But in actual fact, you were simply several days away from various trading centers on the coast. And if you're making butter or cheese in these, remember, you've got cows, you're making butter or cheese, you can take it to these trading centers, For example, Oslo is a little bit of a later town, Bergen as well, but perhaps we might be thinking more Kaupang or Avaldsnes, somewhere along the west coast of Norway. Potentially you could be trading it, and that could be traded across the North Sea. So within, a week, 2 weeks, you could be trading in England. If you were in the middle of the mountains of Norway, and it's a real show of the interconnection. And this path is sort of one of the links in the chain, because we do wonder how were they fed in these trading towns on the coast. But these mountain routes, that gives an opportunity for people from the mountains to trade wares and have a connection with people who were on the coast. Another interesting thing is that it potentially was for fodder as well, because of course all these cattle had to eat during the winter. You had to put them in barns because it gets really cold in Norway, so they can't be out in the field, and so they would need fodder from somewhere. And this might be what we find as they describe in this next section. They say the 66 twigs found at Lendbreen may represent fragments of leaf fodder that traditionally was stripped from birch strands around both permanent settlements and summer farms. A small wooden object is probably a bit for a young animal, such as a kid or a lamb, and was used to limit suckling and thus maximize milk production for human consumption. An undated scythe blade completes the picture of regional transhumans pastoralism. So that's again looking at what was happening on these trade lanes from the archaeological evidence we find, and this is one interpretation, is that some of these twig bits might have been used as bits, so basically what the animals could chew on. Young animals especially, they want to be suckling all the time, and so it's like why young kids suck their thumbs. You give an animal a bit, they'll bite on that rather than suckling, and so you get more milk that can be taken from the cow and then used for human consumption of milk, for things like cheese and butter, like I was saying, that can then be traded on. Another big important factor in the north, which is why I recommended the Wildest Arctic series, is the trade in tradable luxuries from animals. So for example, it's thought that around that time there were walruses further north in Norway. If you read the account of Ottar or Ottere in Old English, he is in Hordaland, which is in the very far north of Norway. He's trading in things like walrus ivory. That was a huge trade in the Viking Age, but also reindeer. Now, reindeer are very important because their antlers, they drop off every time. That's the difference between antlers and horns, is that antlers, they drop off, whereas horns are permanent. So you've essentially got a huge trade in reindeer antler, and we see that combs made from reindeer antler are incredibly popular during the Viking Age. There's a huge boom in the trade of these, and it starts around the Viking Age, and this is again because there was a closer connection between people in the hinterland, so out in the mountains and the woods. They were connected to people on the coast. Then if you're connected to people on the coast, you can trade that on to some of the other emporia, for example, so Ribe in Denmark, or Hedeby, or Birka in Sweden. You've got Dwarsted, Dorestad in the Netherlands. You've got Hamwich, you've got York, or Eoforwich, or Hamwich is now Southampton in England. You've got all these places that they could be trading in, so there's a huge interconnection, and this was one of the things that was being transported, or what we think is being transported on this mountain pass that has been found. So that's another connection there. This is especially strong until around 1300, when antler gets traded out largely for bone. People start to prefer bone. It's more of a fashion thing rather than anything else, so the trade kind of declines. But reindeer hunting again was a huge thing. Now, as I hinted at earlier, they think that they were actually using these paths when there was snow on the ground, so you could travel really late in the season or early in the season, because it seems counterintuitive, but actually if you think about it, when you're on the snow you can ski. Remember that they did know about skiing at the time. In fact, I think even they called some of the fins the ski fins, because they overlaps. As well, you can use sleds, as has been shown, and actually it might be easier to travel when there's snow on the ground, even with horses, which we have a lot of evidence for, because if you look at the scree when it's bare, then it's incredibly difficult to move, because sometimes it's very sheer, it's very slippy, it's not good for horses to grasp. So actually the snow might have made it much easier for people to travel during these winter months. Now, why particularly in the Viking Age do we see a boom in this trade? Why weren't they that connected in, for example, the migration era or the Roman era? And why is it around 1000 that we see this great surge? Well, I guess to answer that, we need to see what changed from before. But beforehand, you had a lower population density in the Roman and the migration era in the higher mountains, and so there's less cargo capacity for long distance trade in the ships as well. And that means there were also more localized power structures, so regionalism was a lot more important. So there's less incentive to go out and trade with people who are very far away, because there's more happening in your local area. You know, you're more worried about what your neighbor's going to do rather than going out and sailing and trading on the high seas. And I think that is important to remember. We do see a boom in population towards the start of the Viking Age. It's one of the possible factors for the Viking Age is that the population keeps increasing and increasing, and that potentially a warmer climate made it easier for different areas to become habitable and for new farms to be established. As well, we see that with the failure of the permanent lowland crops during the late Antique Little Ice Age, there was this pesticide that spread around and had huge impacts, which we're only just starting to really see the effects of. The high elevation of transport of hunted food resources became vital. So if your crops are failing in the normal lowland areas, then you're much more reliant on, say, hunted food that was coming, like the reindeer, for example, that could be transported along these mountain passes. So that made them more important as well. And during the Viking Age, it was a time of really high mobility. There was lots of international trade because Scandinavians were moving between areas of the Irish Sea, the North Sea, of course, and the Baltic, and they connected all of these trade areas. They even went down to Byzantium at the time and connected that and connected with the Arabs. That's why you see diddums, as well as going across to North America. So essentially what they did was they combined all of these trades. So international trade became much more important than it had been in the migration era, as well as much more centralization. So Norway becomes a nation. Well, I say becomes a nation. It's a very, very problematic, and I hate that word, but it's a very problematic thing around the start of the 10th century, and lots more urbanization as well. So you get real urban centers, especially on the coast, like Oslo, Bergen, Gaupang, and various other places. So they need to be supplied from the hinterland. So there's more connection between people up in the mountains and those on the coast in these towns or cities. Alright everyone, I feel like I really kind of went off on a few rants towards the end of this one, but hey ho. So I hope you have found this one interesting. Again, do check out the article. I don't think I can link it because I think I have special access thanks to my university, so I don't want to accidentally link that when I'm not supposed to. But you can look it up. The article, I can definitely link the news coverage article, and potentially they have a link to the actual article. If not, it's in Antiquity, which is a historical journal or an archaeological journal. But I really thought this was interesting, and I'm very curious to see what else comes out from under the ice in Norway. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. This has been The History, and I have been Hilbert.